Hey everyone, and those of you who are not able to make it today, my name is Andrew and I'm from Terra Flora Soil Works in Chilliwack here. We're a worm farm and we focus on creating really high quality composts that are both nutrient dense and full of life. And compost is not a very well understood word because compost, does anyone know what they think compost is?
It's basically mulch. Actually lives inside of it,
Yeah,
in the middle of it.
you got it. You just said the key word. It's full of life, and that's how it makes fertility. And so a lot of people. That's great, JJ. Thank you. There's a lot of people. They say compost is a fertilizer, which is true, but how and why? And if we think about compost as a fertilizer, you're trying to make one thing fertilize all plants on Earth. You think that's a big ask. It's like, you go only to eat hamburgers. That better be a really good hamburger and a really nutritious hamburger, right? It's going to have lettuce, tomato, cheese, the buns. You get all the food groups. And that's kind of what we're trying to do with compost. And in nature, if anyone who's made a compost pile, I got a really nice pile of manure next to me here. Eventually, worms end up in the compost. Has anyone seen worms in the garden or? Yeah?
Yeah.
Yeah. So there are many different types of worms, and today we're going to be talking about earthworms and what's so special about them. Why did I start a worm farm? It's because when you make compost, worms eventually move in, and they're the last organism to consume organic matter, which is anything rotting, anything that was a leaf, or it could have been grass that an animal ate. Worms are the very last thing to touch it before we call it soil. So worms literally poop soil. You can put it in your mouth, it won't hurt you, might even make your immune system better. And what I noticed when I started trying to grow my own food, I have inflammatory bowel disease. It's kind of like colitis, kind of like Crohn's disease. I get inflammation all the time. When I eat, I get tired, or worse, I get really sick. And when I started growing my own food, I actually had energy when I ate that food. And that really, it didn't make sense to me. I wanted to understand why. I was spending a lot of money buying food from Whole Foods. I lived in the city, actually. I figured it out. It turns out that you're not meant to eat food that was harvested like a month ago. It's not very nutritious. So the holy grail is to grow your food yourself and harvest it fresh. And in order to get the best fertility in your garden, compost worms are the connection that I'm trying to put together here. So when in nature, everyone's seen a tree full of leaves. What happens in the fall? The leaves fall to the ground. How do those leaves end back as soil? Fungi, bacteria, all sorts of things that we can't really see. They get in there and they break it down.
Basically fall down and the worms eat them.
You got it. And that's it. And then they poop soil. So what we're doing at the worm farm is we're raising worms and we're feeding them different foods to create a different output. You've heard what you are, what you eat. Same thing is true with worms. So what I want to teach you is that compost is like saying, I have a car, or even I have a vehicle. Well, a truck's a vehicle. The little John Deere's a vehicle. I don't know if you see behind me. The Bobcat's technically a vehicle, right? But when you're saying compost, well, what kind of compost? And it really matters. It really depends on what did you start with, right? It could have just been cow manure, and that's all that your compost was, and then it ended up becoming a fertilizer. So that's going to be sort of limited in what it can do. If you combined horse and dairy and pig and so on, you start to get more of a diverse compost, more of a complete meal. And so when you're worm farming, one of the best ways to worm farm is actually to use your food waste. And that would be your lettuce, your tomatoes, your any kind of greens. Say you had rice for dinner, you cook that. The worms will eat that too. They'll pretty much eat anything that was living, except they don't like meat and they don't like dairy. They don't like protein, really. So compost worms they're really manure worms. They like to eat manure, but they will also eat food waste. Just if you put meat in there, and the way it works in nature is worms don't have teeth. They kind of have a gizzard. Yes, JJ?
Chickens like meat, any kind of meat,
Yeah. Chickens are a great way to deal with meat.
and feed it to them, and they'll run after you.
You bet. They're loyal to a paycheck. Just like the worms that I'm going to show you. So really what I'm trying to get across here is that, you know, what you feed your worms will influence how fertile or how great your compost is. So we want to, you can feed worms just manure, you can feed them just tomatoes or just coffee grounds, but you want to feed them all different types of things. That way your compost can work with more different plants. And so diversity is really the key. Just like, you know, if everyone's the same, it's kind of boring. You know, everyone's got the same taste. It's nice when someone maybe likes orange, someone likes red, someone likes blue. I mean, look at all the different colored clothing we got today. It's nice, right? Vibrant. So worms are the kind of the same thing. Compost are the same thing. We want to have a diversity of inputs. Now, what's special about worm castings or worm poop is, first of all, I said you could put it in your mouth. That's amazing. And I actually was teaching some grade school kids, and I told them that, and before I turned around, man, this kid had a whole mouthful in his mouth. And that's pretty amazing. And that's because, really, like I said, they poop soil. And what is really significant about this soil that they poop is that it has something called a growth hormone. Does anyone know what a growth hormone is? Yeah?
It's basically something that makes the roots grow and
You got it.
Wow.
You nailed it. So like in men, testosterone, that's a growth hormone. That's a hormone that makes you big and strong and so on, right? So plants have one, and there's one called auxin, and it's responsible for increasing the size of the root ball by about 30%. So if you think in the context of a plant, you all seen trees that blow over when their roots aren't firmly rooted in the ground, right? So you want a big, strong rootstock to make that plant strong so it can handle the wind, but also the bigger the roots are, the more water it has access to, and the more microbes that it can reach. And actually, maybe anyone here have a phone, I want you to just Google, and you guys on the video do this, pull up Google and search for soil food web. I'm going to show you the picture here. Let's really quickly talk about this image, and I'll help connect it to worms and why it's special. So the soil food web, and I want you guys to remember this. I'm going to test you at the end, okay? The soil food web describes the life that we can't see that's living in the ground. And so you look at this picture, underneath the tree, there's organic matter, and then there's fungi, bacteria, protozoa, springtails, nematodes, mites. It starts to get to things that you can see, but it starts off microscopic. And these things, they all eat each other, and as they do, they poop fertilizer. So if you're wondering, how does compost provide fertility to a plant? It's because these microorganisms are eating each other, and as they do, they're pooping, and that poop happens to be right in the root zone of the plant.
She's
Pooping right now! You can't get any better than that. Can we get that on camera?
I missed that one.
What a cow.
She's listening.
It kind of makes sense, right? If we think about bigger in the real world, right? The macro world, you got a gazelle or a cow that eats the grass, and then what happens? A cougar, a tiger, a bear, or whatever will come along and eat that cow or eat that deer or gazelle or whatever. The wolves will do it. It's a web. They're kind of eating each other, and that's how they survive. So the same thing happens in the soil, and it's happening in the roots of the plant. And why? Why is that life in the roots of the plant? Well, if you look at this picture, I want you to notice there's that sun. So the sun shines down and it heats the earth, things grow. The trees, right? You can see the leaves there. Have you guys heard of the word photosynthesis? You guys learned about that yet? See some head shaking, that's good. So when a plant does photosynthesis, it's creating sugar mostly. It's a little more complicated than that, but let's just say sugar. And what it does is it sends that sugar into the soil. Anyone want to guess why it does that? Okay, it does that because it wants something. And that's what the soil food web does. We have the soil food web, which can't create sugar. And we have a plant that can't create nutrients. So they both have something that each other needs. So the plant trades some sugar to the microbes, and the microbes trade nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium and boron and all the elements on the periodic table. So there's this, it's kind of like an exchange that's happening. There's a synergistic relationship. So the sun shines, photosynthesis happens, plant trades up to 30% of its sugars. It trades it with these microbes. The microbes then go, and it's like asking anyone here, does anyone have a sandwich? Go get me a sandwich, I'll give you $5. And you run off, you go get a sandwich, I'm fed, and I give you $5, we're both happy. So that's what's happening in the soil, and the best way to get those microbes in the root zone is worm castings. The worms and compost compost is a vehicle for life. You think of it, who here's been on antibiotics? Okay, ruined my life. Maybe saved my life, I don't know, but then ruined it. And so what do we take after we have antibiotics? Probiotics, right? So kefir, kimchi, yogurt, any of these kind of fermented foods and things, they're full of the microbes that break down food, and we want to get them back into our gut. So think of worm castings and compost as a probiotic for the soil. So any kind of compost is going to do a pretty good job, but what makes compost great compost is that the worms have been through it. And this is super important. I'm not going to get too much into it because, like I said earlier, like compost isn't compost, it's compost. It's like saying I have a vehicle. Well, what kind of vehicle? If you want me to take a truckload of manure, you better have a truck. I'm not going to dump that in your little Kia or your little Geo Metro or whatever, right? That's a car. That's not meant for moving manure. So compost can be tailored to what you want to be doing. And so worm castings also, there's another word for that called vermicompost. So vermicompost and worm castings are the same thing. A worm casting is a type of compost. And when you put it in the soil and you put it in the root zone, amazing things happen. I want you to think, I see some mothers here. What do you want for your child, right? Natural childbirth, right? And breastfeed that baby. Why? Because in the birth canal, it picks up the immune system. And then we all know mother's milk is absolutely the best thing that you could possibly give your child. Formula if you had no other choice. Well, the same thing with a plant. When it germinates, when that root comes out, we want to get it in touch with the soil food web and as much of the soil food web as possible. We want bacteria, fungi, protozoa, nematodes, and we want all different kinds, right? And then that plant will select which ones it likes, and it will feed them. And really, your plant becomes like a farmer. It will trade what it wants to trade, and then the microorganisms that it doesn't really care for, or maybe they're just not suited to trade what they need, well, they go dormant. And then meanwhile, the ones that are, it will feed. And now I'll give you an example. Who's heard of pH? It's a little more an advanced thing. It's potential hydrogen. It's a measurement in soil of its acidity. So if it could be really alkaline or basic, or it could be really acidic. And plants kind of like things kind of in the middle. 7 is kind of in the middle. You can go minus, you can go positive. So did you know that plants can actually adjust the pH of soil? And they do that by feeding either bacteria if they want it to become alkaline, or they'll feed fungi if they want it to become acidic. So think of all these farmers who, for example, blueberry farmers are always putting sawdust down, and then they're following it with maybe sulfur or some other application of something because they're trying to get it to go acidic. But the problem with the using chemicals and things like this is it's not permanent. What you really want is more microorganisms to live in the area, and you want them to create the environment allowing the plant to have a relationship with them. So that's one of the reasons why we want, again, diversity in our compost. So if we had no fungi in our compost and we put compost down and it was say it was a blueberry bush or something that really wanted some acidity, it wanted some fungi, it wouldn't be a very good compost. So when we're making a compost, we want to feed or add a feed stock to the compost that will ensure that there's some fungi in there. And that's what I'm going to show you now today. I've got a worm farm here. It's just a blue container. It's a Rubbermaid tote. And I want you to notice it's shallow. That's really important. And then I've got, you can't see them, but I got holes all the way around the side, and then I've got holes on the top, and I will bring this thing closer. Now what's special about compost worms is that they like it to be very, very humid. They like a lot of moisture, at least 60%, and they like it dark. They're actually afraid of the light. So that's why we have a lid on. The lid has holes so that we can have some air, because they're like me and you, they like to breathe.
Well, they have to breathe.
Well, what happens if you don't breathe?
You die.
You got it. That's what happens to the soil food web if it can't breathe. So it's a whole other topic, but what we really want is we want aerobic. We want oxygen. We want air. So that's what we got in this bin, and that's why we have the holes in the top. You know, you can see this. Well, maybe what we'll do is we'll put some pictures up of this, but it's a very, very low cost worm farm that you can make yourself. And inside here, I've got, why don't you guys come around and just come down here and let's take a look.
Don't eat anything.
You guys take a look, and while you're doing that, I'm going to show the camera. These are red wiggler compost worms. Are they showing up okay? Good. Okay. So you notice they're called red wigglers. They're kind of purple in color, a little bit. Okay. So what's special about this worm is that it only lives on the surface, right? So if you guys seen those big long worms that come out when you're walking on the ground, they sense the vibration and they come up. That's an earthworm. This is also an earthworm, but this is a special type, and it's called a compost worm. And they can get a little bit bigger than this, but I want you to notice it's dark in color. It's almost purpley. I don't know why it's not called a purple wiggler, but anyway, it's a red wiggler here, and you can see it's moving around, and it's looking to get out of the light because the light is very harsh on them, and actually just about 10 minutes in the light like this and it can kill them because they don't like the UV. So that's why we have the lid on there, and you can see in here I've got some chunks of wood. You see those chunks of wood?
No,
You're blind? Oh man, do I need to get you some glasses? Yeah, so you can see we've got some wood in here. This is so that we have some fungi in our worm castings at the end. And I know you can feed compost worms just vegetables or just manure, but like I said earlier in the talk, what you feed them can influence the quality of the output. So by putting in, there was some hay in here, some grass, things that fungi like to break down. So if we were to look under a microscope, we would see fungi in here as well, which is really important because I want to get fungi in my garden. Now, to show you how powerful and potent this is, that's about how much I would put on my lettuce transplant on the roots. I would rub it right on the roots. You can't see, it's just my thumb. It's not a lot. Not a lot is needed. And why is that? Because remember we talked about how the sun and then the photosynthesis and it sends the sugars down, right? Anyone have a cold before?
Oh,
The flu? Something like that, right? How much flu did you need to get sick? Not a lot, right? Someone maybe sneezed on you, maybe you were in the elevator, I don't know, something like that, right? Doesn't take much. And then what happens? The flu bug gets in you, and what does it start doing? It starts breeding. It starts replicating, and it becomes so big in number that you get sick. So in the soil, when we take this and we put it on the roots of a plant, we're infecting it, but we're doing it with something good. And because the plant is going to trade sugar to these microbes, what is it going to do to them? It's going to grow them. It's going to breed them up. It's going to make lots and lots more. And then these microbes are going to return the favor go get some nitrogen or something else that the plant wants, and then they're going to feed the plant, so they trade. So you can see as a compost, this is not a lot of compost needed to get a plant everything that it needs, so that it once it's in the ground, it can then start feeding and continue to feed and grow these microbes up and do whatever it needs to do to work with nature to get its fertility instead of feeding it chemicals. Does that all make sense? Any questions? No?
I have some questions.
Yeah, go for it.
Because I've been throwing I'm going to have problems because I'm going to dig it all into the soil and some of it's going to grow. And I've been thinking I need to throw worms in my garden to help break it down. I'm sure there's a better.
Some right here.
I know some worms are right there. I've heard that. So I'm interested in your thoughts on this, and I've heard that they don't like citrus. Is that true also?
Yeah.
Okay.
Now it kind of works like this. They'll eat anything.
Okay.
But in the beginning, because they have no teeth,
yeah,
they got no way of breaking it down.
Yeah.
It needs to be composted first. So you think of those hot compost piles, those big steamy piles. My dog died last year, and I put my dog in a compost pile, and it was gone in 3 weeks. Completely gone. No bones, nothing.
From the
That's
worms?
hot compost.
Okay.
That's a thermophilic compost pile. So that's how things happen in nature. If you put a lot of organic matter together in one spot, it's going to get real hot. This is called cold composting. So if I put my dog in this, they wouldn't eat it. First, black flies would show up and lay maggots. And then the maggots would get in there. Maggots are sharp. They can get in there, and we call them degraders and shredders. They'll get in and they'll tear up the flesh and everything else, and then they'll poop. And then the worms will then eat their poop. So that's how an animal ends up eventually. It's kind of like a food chain. So when an animal dies, it's usually the flies and things like that will get in, or another animal, right? Maybe a bird will eat a rodent or whatever, and then it poops it out, and then something else will eat that, and so on. So the very last thing to eat your food will be a compost worm. So to get a lemon, to answer your question, to get a lemon peel or an onion, right? You think of how long, if you just throw that on the ground, it's going to be there for a while.
Yeah.
So you got to break it down first, and that's why they don't really care for citrus. It can be done though.
Okay.
Definitely not in a system like this.
Yeah.
We have a larger commercial system called the Hungry Bin.
Yeah.
That's quite large, and it's the same form factor as like a recycling bin. It's about 160 liters,
Yeah.
and it's so big that if I put lemons or onions in the corner, not covering the whole surface, so I just put them in the corner. Eventually, 2, 3, 4 weeks later, the bacteria, the fungi that are also in the worm bin, they will break that down and make it soft, and then the worms will move in. So the only, I actually feed my worms lemon and onions and things like that, but I put it in a corner, and I don't do it all the time. It's not a lot. If you were eating onions all day, every day, then, you know, worms isn't the best option. You want to compost the onions first, and there's a method called bokashi composting that is perfect for that. You put it in a bucket, you close the bucket, and then anywhere from 2 weeks to 4 weeks, you can then, you're basically fermenting it. If you think of like an onion, once it's fermented, it becomes very soft, or if you cook it, same thing. So now that it's soft and fermented, now the worms can get in and eat it. So the method you described of just putting food and burying food in your garden is totally normal, and it works. The downside is you've got a dog or trash panda or, you know, any of those rodents and things. They like to come in and dig it up. So that's kind of why, you know, people don't want to do that. And that's where a system like this, it's got a lid on it, you know, and I could have this indoors. Then, you know, you're not going to have rodent problems necessarily.
So for us who, you know, just have a few little garden boxes in the back, and are living in the city, and we want to help our gardens out. So then what we do, we get a bin like this, we get some worms.
Get some worms, and then
what do we feed it?
You feed it lettuce, tomatoes, green peppers.
Oh, we do throw our compost in the worms?
Yeah, you just chuck it in. Now, if you chop it up really fine,
it's better?
Yeah, and if you put it in your Vitamix, even better. Blend it up. And that way, you're just accelerating how fast it is until that food is soft enough for the worms to come in. So I have my worm farm in my kitchen. Might seem a little strange, but
is it this size roughly?
It's a big green bin. Why don't you guys all can someone give me a smell? What does this smell like? See, she's like, oh no, don't do it. What do you think?
Take get in there. Come on,
whiff.
get in there.
Go deep.
Come on, Willa.
Come on, Willa. Don't be a girl. Be tough.
She is a girl.
Come on. Oh, you
Oh,
are.
it smells so good. What do you think?
It's probably beautiful.
Of course
bet
it
you
does,
it's so
because
good.
it's dirt, so it has to smell like
I
dirt.
bet you it's citrusy.
It kind of smells like nothing, right? Almost like the forest.
Like a trick question.
It is kind of a trick question because I would say this is neutral. It has no odor, and that's what you want when a worm farm is running properly. There will be no odor. If there's an odor, something's wrong, right? And in nature, when things become anaerobic, which means there's no oxygen, they start to stink. Who here farts? Anyone ever smell a fart? They don't smell good, do they? No, you don't even like your own brand.
Very good.
Yeah, no good. Why? Because it's anaerobic. And that's, we were created, or whatever you believe, you know, we're here and we're designed in such a way that when we smell something we don't like, we want to get away from it. And that makes sense because plants are actually the same. If it stinks in here, I wouldn't feed this to a plant. It'll probably kill the plant. If it smells neutral like this, kind of smells like the forest floor, I would feed that to my plants. And you don't need any high-tech equipment. This is real simple stuff. It smells okay, and it's you know, it's broken down, it's soft, and kind of, I don't know if you guys want to feel this, but it's just soft.
Yeah. Sonny said, I hope I get
So how many worms are in that container?
2,000.
2,000 worms in there?
Yeah, 2 pounds.
check it out.
So there's 1,000 worms in a pound, approximately?
Approximately, yeah.
So can I feed it? So I'm guessing that if I threw my kitchen scraps in the Vitamix every day, I would have half a Vitamix of puree. Can they handle that much every day?
Not a bin this size.
Okay.
This one could handle, you could feed it, and then you might want to wait a couple weeks before you did that again. So you just need more worms in a bigger bin.
So can you walk us through
Or
how
more bins.
you would maintain something like this? Like what you would feed it, would you cover it?
Well, so
What would you do?
that's a great question. Look, a bin this size is great for classrooms. It's great for teaching. It's not very practical for actually breaking down food. We just eat too much food every day. My wife and I, it's just us, right? 2 adults. We feed our hungry bin, and it's about 2 kilograms per day. So that's like an ice cream pail. And that's about how much food waste both of us generate. We eat a lot of vegetables, the meat and the bones and things that goes into the bokashi bucket. So we feed all of our grains and everything else in the worm bin. And that one has 12 pounds of worms in it. 12 pounds of worms can do about 2 kilos per day. So that's to give you an idea of like a family. I mean, my wife and I eat a lot of vegetables. So maybe we're on the higher end of how much we would feed. But you know, a family of 4, typically one hungry bin, or you know, I would have probably 8, 9, or 10 of these, right? And then you know, you can start to see like there's some challenges here, both because you're gonna have a lot of bins, but now also, how do I get my fertilizer out of here? Well, you have to wait for the food to get eaten, and then you have to separate the worms from their poop. How do you do that? And it's a really great question. You have to. It takes about 6 weeks. You stop feeding. Once they're done, you dump it out and you sift it. And you sift it through multiple screens. So the first screen's quite big. It lets them fall through, and then the last screen is about 1/8 of an inch. And once it's 1/8 of an inch, you end up with all the poop goes through. So you have a bucket of poop, and then in the bottom tray you'll have your worm cocoons, which are the little eggs that they lay. And I'll just pass one around here. There's about 3 or 4 worms in there, little lemon. And so you want to save those because those are going to hatch out, so your worm population keeps growing. And then in the top tray you'll have the larger particles of wood and so on that you want to put back. So
that's why that hungry bin is really nice, right?
exactly, it's called a flow-through bin. So the worms just stay in the top, and then you harvest out the bottom. but you got to. It's one of these things where you got to spend money in order to get that convenience. There's absolutely nothing wrong with this, and there's nothing wrong with sifting. Learning tool for people. When I'm in a classroom, this is my go-to to show kids, because I want them to get in there and, what's a cocoon? Or there's other things living in here, a lot more than worms. Even though we call it a worm bin, it's really a soil food web bin. You know, it's got millipedes and centipedes and protozoa and springtails and mites and spiders and all kinds of stuff. Yeah,
so
little tiny ones.
Could you actually put food on when you're wanting to harvest the castings? Could you actually put food on one side?
Yeah.
And then they'll go migrate
to that side? They will all migrate and then take the food out. Yeah, that's a really great question. And one of the great foods to do that is a watermelon, a cantaloupe, avocado. Take an avocado, cut it in half. Like, you ever get a rotten avocado? That's perfect. Chop it in half, take this pit out, put the sides face down, just wait 4 or 5 days, and then you'll pull up that avocado, it'll be covered in worms. And then now that's one way you can get your worms out. And so what I would do is, say I had this system and I would start another one. I would get my worms out, put them in another one, then I would sift this all out and I would use it. Anything that was left over, put it back in the bin to start it over again. So you're always taking a little bit and hanging on to it to start your next one.
So what are you starting with? Okay, so if you had a bin, you drilled the holes.
Great question, yeah.
And then what do you start with?
I like shredded paper, shredded cardboard, coconut coir. If you have it, don't go out and buy it. Just if you had it, peat if you had it, stuff like that.
And then you pop the worms on top of the shredded.
Yeah, and you'd wet it all down. You'll notice it's quite wet in here. I don't know if you can tell, but all this stuff on the side, that's their poop. As they walk around, they poop. They're just like regular animals, like that cow we saw earlier. And it's got to be moist. So you would start by putting the shredded paper in. You would soak it down. And honestly, if you just go on YouTube and how to start a worm bin, there's like 100 billion videos. It's not, there's nothing crazy going on. I personally like to start them with a compost. So I'll take some compost, some just regular compost, and I'll put it in there with the shredded paper and with the wood chips.
Scoop of that?
Yeah, that's not finished though. That's fresh manure. So you want a finished compost.
Okay.
That way it's not, because that's going to attract flies and all kinds of things. You notice there was no flies when I opened this bin, and it has no smell, and that's because there's nothing in here that's attractive to a fly, and you want to keep it that way. That's why we don't put meat in here, because if you put meat in, the worms can't eat it, the flies will come, and then eventually the worms would eat it, but in the meantime it's going to stink. And if you want to use this, you want to have it in your home especially, then you really want to pay attention to what you're feeding them. An outdoor one, you can get away with a little bit more, but that's essentially it. Just take some shredded paper, some compost, mix it together. They like peat and coconut coir because it retains water, and it's kind of airy, and the worms, they like it airy. And what's really important is notice how shallow this is. Don't just go get the biggest container you can find. Worms only live in the top 12 to 18 inches. And that's it. And they really don't even like being down 18 inches. They don't even like being down 12 inches. They like to be on the surface. So a shallow bin like this, I really only have food up to this line. That's it. And then the rest is to allow it to be nice and aerobic, and they can crawl around, and they've got an environment to live in. So
what about reproduction?
Yeah, they're very good at it.
Yeah?
Yeah.
So how fast would 1 pound multiply?
Double in about 90 days.
Wow.
So when we start, for example, the Hungry Bin takes 12 pounds of worms. They're $100 a pound. Nobody's buying 12 pounds of worms. Why would you? Start with 2, becomes 4, becomes 8, and then all of a sudden your bin's full. And that happens in about a year. You go from 2 pounds to 12 plus. And then the great thing about having a worm bin is I can, like right now it's springtime, I'm taking worms and I'm putting them into every single raised bed I've got. Every single container. I'm putting a handful in because the containers froze during the winter and the worms died. But when I put them in there, they're eating, they're helping. Whenever, for example, in a no-till, no-dig style of gardening, you chop, but you leave the root. Why? Because you got to leave food for things to eat. The compost worms, they will leave if there's nothing to eat, or they'll die if there's nothing to eat, just like you and I. So when you do a no-dig, no-till style gardening, it will attract worms in its own right, just out in your garden. But if you have a raised bed or a container, well, how are the worms going to get in there, right? You have to put them in there.
I actually had a question about this no-till thing.
Yes.
This is a recent thing I learned about, and it seems like it is actually a good thing.
Oh yeah.
I have, so we just were renting a place, and there's got beds that have been sitting there and they're a bit overgrown. Like I need to clean them up and stuff.
Yeah.
But basically, it sounds like you're saying this is a good thing. So what do? How do I clean them out so I can plant? You know, and then I'm trying to stir in my compost or my kitchen scraps with the dirt.
Yeah.
So like, what do I do? Just kind of peel it off the top, the weeds, and just leave,
I would
the rest.
pull all the weeds and then put fresh compost on the top. I would or direct seed or transplant into that. If I was going to direct seed, I might seed first and then put compost.
Okay.
Just like a couple inches, just
Right.
enough to we want to block the weeds from landing, and that's what a mulching compost is really good for. And so it's going to provide fertility. And then those, you don't want to, like, weeds you might have to pull out or they're going to keep growing, right? But say it was lettuce, I would leave the lettuce root. I would just chop it. Kale, just chop it. Tomatoes, just chop it. Leave that root behind, because that's what the worms will eat. And then, so what's happening all winter long is they're eating and they're pooping and they're providing fertility, so that when the weather gets nice again and you put a plant in there, you just have to add so much less fertilizer, right? Less compost if you follow the no-dig style. Yes, it takes longer. Like if as a commercial grower, I just did a crop of lettuce and now I want to have kale. Well, if I just chop, I've got all these roots everywhere. How's my kale gonna take off, right? So it's kind of it's a hard thing at a commercial scale to do, but it is possible. You just have more spacing. And sorry, that's my alarm to let me know I've got to stop talking soon. But yeah, yeah. So if we zoom out and we think about what happens in nature, it's like having people on a job site. If you don't pay them, they won't come to work, right? Or in the case of humans, if you don't feed them, they'll die. Animals, you don't feed them, they'll die. Worms, you don't feed them, they'll die or they'll leave. So in the gardening sphere, if we want to keep it living, we want to keep that soil food web thing happening, we need to always keep a living root or something decaying in the ground. So we call this the law, nature's law, is cover the ground with a living root or decaying plant material, compost, mulching compost, or leaves or straw or any of these things. Why? Because it's going to continue to break down, it's going to continue to feed, and as long as they're fed, they'll stick around and they'll continue to provide fertility for you. So in the spring, how we refresh containers and things like that is we would add some worm castings. We would add some compost. And worm castings are just a type of compost. It's just the best compost. If I had to choose one compost, I would just go straight worm castings. But you know, they're expensive, they're time consuming, they're not great for mulch, right? So really I want to have a nice mulching compost to put on the top, and then I want worm castings to get in touch with the roots. So when I plant garlic, for example, in the fall, I take 1 tablespoon of worm castings, I put it in the hole, put the garlic clove in, and then I cover the whole bed with a mulching compost, probably 2 inches. So then I've made sure that as that clove, the roots start to come out, instantly in touch with the soil food web, and then that mulch layer on top is going to ensure that you're not going to get freezer burn from the cold during the winter, and that any weed seeds land, they're not going to germinate so easily. And that's kind of I've really oversimplified a very complex and interesting topic. Like, I mean, you could go get a PhD in just one little area. This is nuts. But for the home gardener, you don't really need to know a lot. You just need to know that living root is the most important thing in your garden. In my raised beds, I grow barley and peas. I put them in August or September, and then they get winter killed. So then all that vegetation, I didn't have to do anything. I just planted it and walked away. It dies. It then feeds the worms. So then I want to go to plant in the spring. I don't have to add a lot of compost. I just add my worm castings, or, you know, you can actually take this and make an extract or a compost tea. You can make coffee or tea. You can make a worm tea or a worm extract. And then I can actually spray fields with this stuff, right? Because remember, we're just trying to infect the plant. As long as you can get this in touch with the roots somehow, you could spray it, you could put it in furrow, you could do all kinds of things. You can inoculate the seeds. There's lots of different ways to do it.
So how long would that amount take to break down?
It depends. if it's indoors, 25 degrees, it stays that way. You know, they can break stuff down in a couple of weeks.
So like that amount, like how soon could you harvest worm castings from
About
that?
6 weeks.
Okay.
So every feed, it's about 6 weeks, and then once that food's been eaten, you know, you can harvest, and then, or you could do another feed. So what you're doing really is in the bin like this, you're kind of creating a lasagna. You keep feeding, then they eat it, and then you feed, and then they eat, and you feed, and you feed, and you're building up layers of poop. And then when it gets to a certain height, right, that the bin only has so much room, I would go and harvest it. So typically like 3 months or so, and then you might harvest, and then you have a good amount, right?
So can you start us from an empty thing? So you start drilling the holes.
Yeah.
You put your newspaper shredded
paper,
and
like a 3-4 inch layer.
Yeah.
Shredded paper. You could use peat, coconut coir. I would encourage you not to go out and buy them. You don't need them, but if you have these things, you can do that. And then compost, finished compost.
Okay.
I like to put that in there, and then I put the food in one
How
corner.
much finished compost would you put in there?
This
Like
I might put in an ice cream pail, a couple ice cream pails.
Okay.
Maybe 8 liters, 8 to
Okay.
10 liters. It really depends on the size of your system, right? The bigger your system is, the more you're going to need. So.
And the better the compost, the better the end result.
I would
right?
just fill it up to this with paper, shredded
Okay.
paper. Just fill it up all the way around, and then I would just put the compost on top. I would soak it down. It's going to shrink. It's going to compress, and then just put the food on there. And we would call this bedding. Like the worms need somewhere to go hang out that's safe for them, right? It's like, why are we all wearing clothing here? It's cold outside. Put a jacket on, right? So same thing in here. They like to be moist and warm, and that's what we're doing when we're creating the paper and we're adding the compost. It's going to provide that nice environment for them. They will eat the paper, and they love cardboard. They love the glue in between corrugated cardboard. Absolutely love it. So putting a nice piece of cardboard cut out, maybe to the size of this, or putting a few pieces in, putting it on there, you'll see they love it. Just fantastic. And you know,
Isn't glue toxic?
no, not the stuff that's in there.
No?
You can even use newspaper as well. The ink doesn't.
You could
Doesn't
even eat it.
Doesn't matter. The only thing I don't put in is like high gloss magazines.
Okay.
Like I wouldn't do that kind. That's just a lot of color, a lot of ink. But like a newspaper print is totally fine. Yeah. And with cardboard, like it helps trap the moisture in. And they love tight spaces. They like to go in between the little corrugated, they'll lay eggs in there and so on. So I found it actually encourages breeding. Put the cardboard in there.
So the ink from the newspapers, it goes, like, doesn't it eventually get to your food?
It gets broken down as it's composting, and that's a good argument to for example, the hungry bin. It takes 1 year from the time I put food in the top to the time it comes out the bottom. That's ideal. And making great compost, one trip around the sun, 1 year, there's a fourfold explosion of life at around 11, 12 months. So there's a really strong case to, yeah, you could make it quick, but if you're going to do things like lots of newspaper, you allow time for nature to take that ink, break it down into its constituent elements that are then safe for us to eat, or plants to take up and eat.
So that hungry bin, it costs like $350 to buy it, and then an extra $200 for 2 pounds of worms to start off with it.
Yeah, and then you got to put compost in it as well.
Yeah.
And so you're really looking at the hungry bin about $600
to get going.
Yeah.
See, I love that idea, but we're not planning to stay here, so we'd be like transporting back to Alberta. I think that sounds like scary for the worms driving across.
Oh, they like it.
They like it. Hey?
We ship them across country.
Yeah.
If you
Nice
put
try,
them,
Charity. Nice
like if
try.
I was going to travel,
Give us your little excuse.
This is a great way. That's why I brought them here in this bin. I like it. It's easy. It's light. I can travel with. I could put about 5-6 pounds in here, and they would be okay for a trip.
Yeah.
I really wouldn't want to be in here for more than a week. That's too many worms for a
and
small
away you
area.
go.
But we ship across Canada, and as long as it's not frozen, right? We only
Are you on YouTube?
What's that?
Are you on YouTube?
We have a couple videos, but not really.
You're the crazy guy who's like, oh, I grow worms like this?
That sounds like John from Growing Your Greens or whatever.
I don't know.
That would be
I was trying to look
that's
up the
kind of the
Hungry
competition.
Well, we're a reseller of the Hungry Bin.
Okay.
And for you can order them online, but we ship them with worms. Our goal is to help you get the whole system set up, and we have some additional things that we add that make it work better, higher capacity. But yeah, I'm out of time, but I have an Instagram, Terra Flora Soil Works. I have a webpage. I'm going to be doing another event like this in person in June at our farm, where we'll have the Hungry Bin. We'll have our big commercial system that you can see how we make worm castings for the commercial market. Kind of a neat little thing. Kids seem to really enjoy it, and parents too. So if you want to learn more, follow us on Instagram or send us an email, and we're happy to answer any questions you guys got.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, you're very welcome.
Excellent.
Thanks,
Thank you.
guys.